You don't have it. Next to stop sharing, there's a yes.
Okay, if everything is okay, then we are going to start with this talk about the emergence of agentive semiotics in the Colombian semiotic landscape. So basically what I'm going to give is a panorama of what has been semiotics in Colombia since its beginnings in the 1960s and what is happening right now. Most of the information comes from some texts by Armando Silva, that is one of the most known semioticians in Colombia. He published this paper about semiotics and social communication, and he has also written several books on semiotics, between them the Imaginarios Urbanos, that is an analytic, semiotic analysis of cities in Latin America, particularly Bogotá and Sao Paulo in Brazil. So basically the semiotics in Colombia has gone around the social communication studies, and basically in two fields. One is formation for journalists, and the other side is from arts and aesthetics that have a lot of research in the questions of how semiotics of arts can be applied to understand the different experiences of art in Colombia, especially in relation with politics and social problems. But still, he mentions that at the start of the semiotics studies in Colombia, it was most like a semiotics fad, a moda de la semiótica, where there were more people like interested in learning all this complex vocabulary of semiotics, but not really knowing what was behind that. But basically he presents four basic moments for the development of semiotics in Colombia. One is the humanist moment that came from the decade of the 60s till the starts of the 70s, and is basically based on readings about people like Ortega and Gasset, Sartre, McLuhan, and other figures from this kind of humanistic perspective. We have to keep in mind that in Colombia, as we have seen in the talks about semiotics in Brazil and semiotics in Mexico, these movements have been related to social problematics and political problematics. We have also have our share of protests and social movements and of course repression. So this interest is also about how the discourse of power in Colombia has been used by governments and other powers in order to control the semiotic, for how to say, landscape in Colombia. So the second moment is related to ideology and the nouns, and this is of course related to what I was mentioning. And so here there is a strong influence of readings from Marx, Barthes, Eco, Peirce, and Morris, and this introduces a new, a more logical oriented way to approach semiotics. And from that, okay, this is in the starts of the 70s, and from the middle of the 70s to part of the 80s, we came to the structuralist moment, where the influences from new figures like Marcuse, Habermas, Benjamin, and Adorno. And finally, in the 80s, he mentions the turn into a culturalist movement in semiotics in the different social communication and arts faculties in Colombia, and the influences are from Wittgenstein, Austin, Van Dyck, and Gertz, and we introduce here this idea, for example, of the semiotics of discourse. So this was the starting panorama, but we could say that up to the decade of the 80s to the start of the 90s, there is a slight loss of interest in these semiotics studies till the middle and the end of the 90s and the start of the new millennium. But this interest in semiotics was concentrated in different academic spaces. Here we see a photo of the very iconic Plaza del Che in the National University in Colombia, that, as you can see, is full of different semiotic items. But along with this university and space, we have different other spaces like the social communication faculty in the University of Jorge Tadeo Lozano, that later will create the Master in Semiotics. Also we have the arts faculty semiotic orientation in the National University. Also, there was an interest in literary semiotics, like in the Universidad Tecnológica de Tunja, and a semiotic seminar given by the Universidad Nacional in the Department of Linguistics. There is also a Master in Semiotics from the Universidad Industrial de Santander, and some studies in semiotics and hermeneutics from the Faculty of Humanities of the Universidad Nacional de Medellín. So these are mostly like the main spaces where semiotics has been studied in Colombia, not the only ones, but mostly the most old and with most contributions to semiotics research in Colombia.
Over here. Hello.
Thank you. And along with this, we have some groups and some publications in Colombia that are related to semiotics, not exclusively, but most of the articles that are presented there have to do with this subject. So in 1987, the Association for the Semiotics Association of Colombia was created, and it later changed its names to the Association of the Semiotica de Colombia. And along with this, we have some magazines, for example, the Thesaurus magazine, that is one of the oldest publications in this field in Colombia, by the Institute Caro y Cuervo de Bogotá, that is related to linguistic studies. We also have Forma y Función, Shape and Function, from the Linguistic Department of the National University. Signo y Pensamiento, Sign and Thinking, from the Social Communication Faculty of the Universidad Javeriana. And more recently, Razón Crítica, the magazine from the Social Communication Faculty of the Jorge Tadeo Lozano. And all these magazines have been the medium for presenting new research and texts about semiotics in Colombia. But I want to focus in my alma mater, the Semiotics Study Group and Master in Semiotics from the Jorge Tadeo Lozano University. This appears as a Semiotics Study Group founded in 2002 by professors of the university with interest in semiotics, of course, and the study of the science of the science. And they have managed, for example, to publish different books, between them a translation from the Manual of General Semiotics, or Handbook of General Semiotics, by Jean-Marie Klinkenberg. And from that point, they have created this semiotic collection of books, between them the Semiotics Essays, that has 2 volumes, and a third one is in preparation. where different research papers related to semiotics and particularly to agentive semiotics have been published. And there are some books about, for example, semiotics of design and semiotics in visual arts and film arts by some students and professors from this Master in Semiotics from the Jorge Tadeo Lozano. And now getting into the topic, central topic of this talk is the subject of agentive semiotics. That is a new methodological proposal by Professor Douglas Niño that has been the director of the Social Studies Department in Communication Studies Department of the Jorge Tadeo Lozano University. And all this is consigned in this book called Elementos de Semiotica Agentiva, Elements of Agentive Semiotics. That is basically the core book about this new approach to semiotics. So basically, and in one phrase, what Niño proposes is that the significance is established, or more precisely, it emerges in the relation between agent and agenda. That is the relationship between an agent, an entity that can do things, and an agenda, the kind of result that this agent is looking for with his actions. I'm going to go deeper into this theory or proposal. So let's start. The first thing is, what are the theoretical compromises that this new approach is taking as a basis? So there are four basic elements. The first is an epistemological pragmatism that is based on the ideas by Peircean, James, and Dewey. One of the core elements of this first fundament is the idea of the embodiment. That means that any semiotic process must be related or must emerge from an embodied entity. So semiotics doesn't exist in the vacuum or in some abstract space, but it's always related to some entity with a body that is able to enact actions with the environment that surrounds him. And there is also a relationship between the significance and the objective as proposed in the theories by Peirce. The second compromise is with a phenomenomic adequacy, and this is related to the ideas by Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, and Gallagher. This is related to the gestaltic experience, and here the body appears again. So any analysis or research done by a cognitive semiotics approach must have in its core the body as the source of this kind of semiotic experiences. And also has this idea that life and signification have a shared origin, so they are not separated entities as some other approaches take them, but they are closely interrelated and one cannot exist without the other. Another foundation is the sensibility to empirical findings, so everything must be based on supported in findings by cognitive sciences, and the idea that signification exists before the emergences of consciousness. So there are entities, living entities, that are able to generate signification even if they are not able to have active consciousness in the way that we understand it. And finally, we have the cognitive plausibility. So this is related to the ideas of human cognition, mostly the new approaches by George Lakoff. And also the idea of the life and signification have a shared origin. So let's go to some basic definitions. Here, if you see the background for the presentation is the same used in the book, and it has this metaphor that I think is very useful to understand what is the idea of agentive semiotics, the archer pointing an arrow to a target, and this gives us some kind of a basic idea of how this works. So basically, there are two starting definitions. One is the agent, and this is an entity with acting capabilities that in resume we can call it agency. And this agent has a series of purposes, of objectives or targets that he's aiming to with his actions. And that is what we know as the agenda, the objective or result at which the agent aims. And the significance, that is the core question of any semiotic research or approach, in this case is understood as the attribution of meaning that the agent does when he is performing this kind of acts towards the achievement of one agenda. And going in more detail, Niño proposes some kind of distinctions. One is the agentive approach to this phenomena that is related to the agent as an entity, and the other thing is the agential part that is related to the objective or the agenda. In this case, Niño describes two kinds of agency. One is the operative agency, that is the one that active agents can perform, and this consists in actions that are aimed to some goals. But there is also a derived agency that the agents give or assign to different objects, among them signs and other objects. Objects we can talk here about, for example, tools. So if we have, for example, laboratory equipment, for example, a microscope, it has some purpose and function, and this purpose and function is created and assigned by the agent when he's creating this kind of objects. So, and we are going to go into this later. From the point of view of agentive semiotics, signs are some kind of tool, some kind of, we can say, abstract object that has some kind of purpose for the agenda of this agent. And for the agent to be able to perform this kind of actions towards the fulfillment of an agency, he has to fulfill some kind of conditions of agency. And basically, there are three of them. The first thing is that he has to be animated. The second one is that he has to be situated. And I will go into detail right now. And the third condition is that he must be able to be attentive to what is happening in his surroundings. So for the first one, Niño mentions some kind of elements or factors that are related to the animated condition of agency. The first one is that when we are talking about an entity that is animated, it means that this is an entity with life. So any non-living object is incapable of producing meaning by itself. Any object that we think can have some kind of, or can provide some kind of meaning, does so because of the actions of an agent. So this agent must have some kind of kinetic perception. So this animated being must have some kind of perceptual systems sight, touch, whatever can provide information to the agent about his surroundings, because without this is not able to comply with the other conditions of agency. The second one is an affectivity. That means that the agent has it could be instinctive or rational necessity or willing to do some kind of actions. Without affectivity, the agent cannot do that. And this affectivity can have different levels. Like, for example, we can talk about the phototropism of plants that move towards the light as a kind of internal sense making of looking for a better source of light in order to perform their living processes, but also can go to some more complex affectivity issues. Like in humans, we can be looking to a goal like get the affection of other persons, get more knowledge, get a higher level of spiritual life or whatever there. But without this, the agency or the meaning cannot appear. Another element related to the animated or a couple of elements is the temporality and spatiality. So the agent must be able to perceive time in some way and to act according to certain temporal parameters, and also to be able to be located in some kind of space. And finally, there is the element of intersubjectivity, that the agent can interact actively with other agents, and this also can have a very basic system like the ones would happen between plants and insects, or even in a much more basic element like what's happening with cells and bacteria and small elements in relation with other agents, more complex. And also, of course, goes to the level of human interaction, where we are able, and this comes from the Husserl phenomenological approach, that in order to being able to communicate, we must, even to act in the world, we must be able to understand other agents as living beings with their own purposes and with their own goals that somehow can interfere with our own. So this is the first condition of agency. The second one is the ability to be situated. And this takes different levels. The first one is that the agent must be able to be situated in his environment. And there are a series of subconditions that this entangles. The first one is the engageability. I don't know how to pronounce that word, but it's basically the capability to enter in relation and act with some effects with other elements in his environment. So, for example, if we take this to the level of a social environment, the agent must be conscious of certain social dynamics and his position between a social system in order to be able to perform actions that make sense inside the system. And that is what creates this engageability. Wow. The second one is the embeddedness. The agent must be able to understand himself as part of this system and as an active part of this system. The third one is the entrenchment. That is related with the concept of habitus. By the experiences that we live while we are growing up inside a society or inside an environment, if we are an animal or other kind of organism, we start developing this kind of habitus that somehow are the patterns that allow us to perform in a meaningful way inside these kind of situations. And finally, the agent must be able to understand its background, not only what is happening to him in a certain moment or time, but also about other things that could be happening outside his area of perception, but that in somehow can influence what he's doing and how his actions will have an effect in the surrounding world. And the final element is the attentive condition. That means that we as agents must be able to focus our attention in some elements. And this is based in two elements: the attentional structure, like how our senses are related to our cognitive tools and structures in our brain in order to make sense of the surroundings, and the attentional dynamics and how is that we can focus on some elements. For example, and Niño explains, if I'm trying to put some thread through a needle, I have to be able to focus on what my hands are doing. And if anyone has experienced this kind of actions, if momentarily we send other information and other things that are happening in our surroundings to a second plane, and we like brought this, what is happening with our hands to the center of our attention. But this means that there is also a perceptual mechanism that allows us to remain conscious of other things that are happening in our environment. So if we hear a loud noise or something like that, we can shift our attention to that other source of information if that becomes relevant, for example, for our survival. So basically, these are the three conditions of agency that allows the agent to perform and engage in this kind of meaning making. And from this, we came to how this works as an agentive fulfillment. So basically, how the agent is able to resolve its agenda. So we start with the agentive capabilities. That is what the agent possesses that allows him to act in his environment and towards certain objective. So these capabilities evolve or are developed as the agent grows inside his environment. And remember, when I talk about an agent, I'm not only talking about a human agent. Any living creature, from a bacteria, from a virus, not also a living creature, but from small cells and unicellular elements to humans, each one has certain agentive capabilities, and these agentive capabilities must match certain requirements from the environment in which it's living. So basically, then we have some inactive conditions that allows the agent to perform. And between them, for example, we have the agentive time. Each agenda must be usually performed in a certain time or frame of time. So putting another example from Niño, if we are performing a test in class, usually we will have a certain time to perform that that test, and if we don't do that in the established time, then there will be a problem, and sometimes it becomes more critical. Like, for example, if you remember the case of the accident or the situation with the Apollo 13, they were in a situation where solving the problem of how to regain the possibility of filtering oxygen and regaining energy in order to come back to the Earth was not an agenda that could be fulfilled in any frame of time. But if it was not performed in a certain moment, well, all their actions and intentions will not be fulfilled, and that will mean the death for the tripulation. So there is one of, for example, the inactive conditions that an agent has to find. The second is related to the other resources. So there are some intrinsic resources that the agent has, like knowledge, of course, the capabilities to act, and that includes, for example, if I want to drive a car, I must have the knowledge of how the car functions and how to start the car and what is the function of different elements of the car in order to do that. But also we have some tools that allows for that. And going back to the example of the Apollo 13 situation, then these astronauts and the people in Earth that was helping them to solve this problem needed some kind of skills, technical skills, knowledge, and things like that in order to know what the problem was, how to find a better solution. But also they needed some kind of resources that, in that case, for example, were very limited because they only counted with what they have brought with themselves into the lunar module. So even if they had an idea of how to solve that, if one of the elements required to implement that solution was not available, then it was not part, it would not be considered or could not be part of the solution, of the real solution for the problem. So this is basically like how this works. And all this brings us to another concept that is the level of precision, and that is why this image of the target becomes particularly interesting and clarifying for this theory, is that if we are aiming to obtain some goal, there are like levels on which this goal is achieved. There is an optimal situation where we hit the target in the hot spot, and we can say that we have managed to do it perfect. But in certain situations, there is also the possibility that even if we manage to comply with the objective, maybe it is not as well as it should be done. And here we can think about, for example, the level of precision of two musicians, one that is not so experienced, maybe a beginner, and a worldwide expert or recognized artist that has years of experience. So the level of precision of one will not be the same as the other, and when they are performing, for example, a musical work or piece, of course, for the people that knows about music, probably will be able to find a certain difference in the what do you say, quality in the performing of this work. So that is basically how these conditions of fulfillment of an agenda work. And yes, so I will start. We're close to the end. We have this all is resumed in what we can know as the agentive actions. And these have three levels. Kinetic, that is basically the things we do with our bodies in order to perform things, riding a bicycle, grabbing a tool. The second are comprehensive, that are actions that are related to obtain information from the environment or from other agents. And the expressive communicative, that is the ones that involve the interchange of information with other agents. I'm going to skip this one, but basically what this explains is that agents don't act or don't exist alone in the universe. We are, especially humans, submerged in a social context, and such we start performing certain roles, for example, occupations or professions, and these occupations have like two sides of it. One is how, as an agent, I perceive that I am doing or enacting this kind of social roles. And the second aspect is how other agents that surrounds me expects me to perform. So if I am a teacher in a classroom, I will do some kind of actions like giving the lecture, speaking, presenting slides and examples, and but my students and the people that has hired me will expect for me that that I will be able to, for example, answer the questions that the students present, to clarify what I'm trying to explain, and these kind of things. So basically, that means that from myself as an agent, I will have some kind of degree of rigor, how I expect to perform, but there is also a rigor standard that is how other people expect me to perform. And between these two appears the concept of confidence, like how confident I am that I will be able, for example, to drive a car without having an accident, things like that, and how society expects me to drive a car by respecting signs, traffic signs, and other regulations. And basically, one of the things that are explained here is that the agendas are elements that are that constitute and regulate the context where we interact. So, and these agendas and these contexts in which we operate are the product of interactive interactions, and usually have a socio-historic creation. So context doesn't appear from nothing. They come from a long history of other situations, and here there is some kind of elements that constitute part of what is a context in which an agent behaves. And we came to the central question about this is, well, and what happens with the signs and the concept of significance in agentivism. So Niño proposes that there must be a review of this dichotomy between the sign of and the object. Niño proposes that both the sign of the object has the same nature, and basically the difference is an element is used to represent another element, or is this element or object is the one that is represented. And he puts the example of a photograph that in other approaches consider the photograph as a sign of something else, the element that is photographed, but the photograph in itself is also an object that is subjected to certain conditions, and this object can become also an element to be represented by other things. So for example, I can have a photography of a photography in a book that represent, for example, some famous photograph by some foreign famous photographer. So it's not the same as you have this duplicate of or copy of that photograph as having the actual photograph, and the element in the photograph then becomes like a third element. So he starts talking, instead of sign, of semiotic items, and that includes objects and quasi-objects. So an object is what usually we refer as an object, and a physical, or not necessarily physical. We can have also abstract objects like ideas of justice and things like that, and quasi-objects that in this case, for example, is this photograph as the element that represents an existing element in the world. So if, for example, I have a photograph of a flower, I have the visual representation of the flower, but it will not give me the smell of the flower or the texture of the flower. So in that sense, this photograph is understood as a quasi-object. And basically, the idea of these semiotic items is that they arouse certain agent responsiveness. That means that the agents, when entering, start using this kind of semiotic items, expect to have some kind of response from the items. So, for example, if I create some kind of sign, a traffic light, for example, I expect that other agents can understand what I'm trying to convey by that element and had some kind of response. So if I see the red light, I expect to other agents to stop moving, or if they are driving, to stop the car in the presence of a red light, and that will be the agent responsiveness. And from here, it comes to the notion of significance that is based in the ground. The ground is this kind of concepts and responsiveness that we have developed through our relationship with the world, and the semiotic responsiveness that we expect to generate when we interact with other objects or with other agents. I think we don't have too much time.
Yeah, 3 more minutes.
Okay, just to wrap up a little how this works, I'm going to put an example of how significance works in the agentive approach. So this is an example from the book of Niño, a scene from the movie Hot Shots, where if you haven't seen that, these 2 actors, Charlie Sheen and Sin Shin, that are father and son, are in the same scene, and they say to each other, "I loved you" in Wall Street. And in order to understand this sequence in the film, the filmmakers expect the moviegoers to have certain elements and basic knowledge of what is happening here. So if you know, this both acted in this movie that is, they both appear in this movie that is Wall Street, where they also were acting as father and son. But in this movie, in Hot Shots, Charlie Sheen is some kind of parody of other action figures like Rambo, and his parent is reenacting a character that he played in another movie that is Apocalypse Now. So in order to understand that, you have to start putting all these elements together. Like these are 2 actors that have represented different characters in different movies that have a common ground, that is in this case a Vietnam War, but they also have a relationship in real world where they are parent and son, and they are actors that have appeared in different movies, and it's by the connection of these different elements that we can establish the element of humor. So, for example, in order to create something like a parody in a movie or in another kind of text, we must be able to establish what are the source of the elements that we are using or that we are transforming into a parody, and how these elements are related to other separated elements that by itself doesn't have any meaning, but when they are integrated into this context that we are creating, it starts having a meaning, and with some luck, will create this response in the public that is loud, or at least some sense of humor. So basically that is all. And if you have any questions, please. Yeah, let me see if we have.
Oh, let's check it out. We can this
Okay.
So we have Sergio Rodriguez Gomez.
Yeah.
Answer this question and read it out loud, please.
Are there connections between agentive semiotics and biosemiotics? I will say yes. Maybe at this moment there has not been like an active research in the field of biosemiotics, as far as I know, relative to agentive semiotics. But if we take in account all these assumptions that I have mentioned about the body and about how the conditions of agency are related to the capability of perceived environment and to interact with other agents into, let's say, an ecosystem, then biosemiotics is necessarily part of what the agentive semiotics must explain. And it will be interesting, for example, like seeing how the notion of the Umwelt by US School can be translated into this agentive semiotics terminology.
Good. So now we have Katarzyna question. So she asks if there are any connections between existential semiotics, for instance, erotarasty, and agentive semiotics.
Oh, no, I at this moment I will not be able to answer that. But it will be interesting to look for this kind of connections.
I think somebody is writing down a question, but meanwhile, do we have any questions in situ from people in the department? If not, I have one. That is more like a, yes, it's a very hard question, but you don't have to answer. It's just like something that came to my mind. So when you were speaking about the agency, it resembles this biosemiotic concept of semiotic freedom, in the sense that the more constraints a system imposes in some sort of like agent or living interpreter, the more creativity the subject has to afford in a way in order to achieve his agenda or its agenda. And so my question would be, if you would say that yes, there are compatibilities